So the next thing that we're going to take a look at here is how to run JavaScript on the back end, right? Now I'm doing this because I realize that for many of you, your main motivation for learning JavaScript may well be to use it on the back end. So I'm going to be showing you right now 2 different ways of running JavaScript code using Node.js. Now the first thing you're going to want to do is actually download and install Node.js on your computer. And what you're going to want to do first of all is find out whether you already have those things installed, right? You may well already have them installed, and in that case, you may not need to download and install it, as I'm going to show you. So the way that you're going to find out whether you have Node installed is by typing node-v in your terminal. And if you have Node installed, what it will do is show you the current version of Node that you have installed. Now, the version that I have here is almost up to date. The current version is actually 16.14 at the time of recording. At the time you're watching this, it's probably something higher. But you're just going to want to make sure that you have a fairly up-to-date version, preferably v16 or higher as the first number. And the other thing that you're going to want to check as well is the version of NPM. Now, we haven't actually talked about what NPM is. Basically, NPM is a tool that you can use in conjunction with Node to install other people's code into your projects. We'll talk about this in much more detail later on. But for now, you're just going to want to run npm-v. And if you have Node and NPM installed, you should see a version for that as well. If you just see something like command not found, then that means you don't have it installed, and you'll need to do the instructions I'm about to show you. So assuming that you don't have Node and NPM installed, what you're going to want to do is go to nodejs.org, and you're going to want to download it. Now, on this page, there are 2 main options that you have for downloading Node.js. One is the long-term support version, and the other is what's called the current version. Now, for most people, right, as Node.js's website itself says, the long-term support version is going to be what's recommended, right? It says recommended for most users. So what I'm going to recommend you do is click on this button, which will download the package for installing Node.js, and once that's completed, you're going to want to click on that, and it will walk you through the installer wizard. Now, if you are feeling more adventurous, I wouldn't recommend this right now, but if you ever want to work with the latest features of Node.js, all you would need to do is just come in here and select the current version instead. And again, you're probably going to be seeing different versions of this than I am right now, because chances are versions will have advanced quite a bit since I recorded this, but everything that I'm about to show you will still work exactly the same way. All right, so let's click on the installer that we just downloaded, and what that's going to do is open up the installer wizard. We're just going to click on continue, agree, and install, and what that will do is it'll probably ask you for your password. So I'm going to enter mine there, and then what we're going to see is it'll just install everything for us. It usually takes, a few seconds max. And then, of course, depending on your operating system, you're going to want to follow the directions that it displays here. I've already done that myself, so I'm not going to do that again, and we're just going to click on close. All right. So now that we've installed Node.js, we should be able to go back to our terminal here, and we may want to close it and reopen it just to restart the terminal. Oops, it looks like we need to click on the trash can button instead. And then we'll open up a new one here. And now what should happen is if we run node-v, we should see that we have the latest version that we saw inside here, right? The long-term support version that is displayed there. And if you run npm-v, you may see a different version there as well. Now, NPM is actually bundled with Node, so by installing Node, as we just did, you're going to have access to NPM as well, right? You don't need to install that as a separate thing. Okay, so now that we've installed Node.js and NPM locally, I'm going to show you how to run backend JavaScript code using Node. What we're going to do here is we're going to start off by just creating a new Express application. It's going to be a very simple project, so actually I'm just inside this folder called Express Course, and inside here I'm going to create a new folder, which I'll open up in my IDE, and we'll just call this new folder something like Frontend Basics. And I'm just going to open this up in my terminal by saying code and then front-end basics, and that'll open that up in another IDE window. Cool, so first things first, let's just initialize this as a new npm package by saying npm init-y. That'll create the package.json file for us, and then we're going to go and install Express by saying npm install Express. And once we've done that, we can create our new server by just creating a new file. And actually, I'll create a new folder called source, and inside here, I'll create a new file called server.js. And then we're just going to set up a very simple Express server by saying import Express from Express. And then we'll say const app equals Express. There we go. And then we'll tell our app to start listening by saying app.listen. And we're going to have it listen on port 8080. And then inside this callback here, just like we've done previously, we'll say console.log server is listening on port 8080. So none of that should be new to you. I'm sure you could do that probably with your eyes closed at this point. But nevertheless, we now have a handy Express server that we can use for demonstration purposes. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do here is create a file that we're going to send back to the front end when the front end sends a request to our server. And this is the first step, really, in starting to execute some of our code on the front end, is we're going to need to send the front end a file containing some sort of code that we want it to execute. So what this is going to look like in our first example here is when our server receives a request from the client, the server is going to send back a file, and this is going to be an HTML file, by the way, containing some scripts inside of it. We'll talk a little bit more about how that works in a minute. And when the client receives this file, what it's going to do is it's going to render all of the HTML, right? And by the way, we're going to be sending this request using a browser on the client side instead of something like Postman, although it's perfectly possible to use Postman for this testing as well. But so when the browser receives this file from our server, what it's going to do, as I said, is go through and render the HTML, and somewhere in that HTML, we're going to add a script tag with some JavaScript code inside of it, right? So we'll be able to execute front-end JavaScript code, and what the browser is going to do when it reaches that script tag is it's going to automatically execute the code that that script contains. So this is how we are really able to start defining what we want the browser to execute from on the back end, is we can just choose what sort of JavaScript code we want to put in this file we're sending back. Okay? So in order to do this, what we're going to do is just create a simple HTML file, and you can create that just inside this source directory as well. So we'll say new file, and then we'll just call it index.html, I suppose. And let's just set up a very simple HTML file here. We're going to have the doc type HTML. Then inside the HTML tags, we'll have the head. And let's just add a title to this page. We'll say something like front-end execution test. And then for the body, we're just going to have a simple H1 heading that says something like, this is a test. Right? That's not really necessary, but it just gives us something to display in the browser so that we can see we've actually received the file. And underneath this, and really this could be anywhere in the HTML document, we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail later on. Underneath this, we're going to put a script, and in between those script tags, as I said, we can start writing JavaScript code. So the simplest piece of code that's really only available in front-end JavaScript for the most part is going to be a function called alert, which will just display a little pop-up window in the browser. You'll see what that looks like in a minute. But what we're going to do is have that alert say something like, hello from the front end. Okay? So that's our simple index.html file. So now what we're going to need to do is have our server send that file back to the front end as a response when it receives a request. So what we're going to do is just define a simple get endpoint that will listen on the home route. And then inside the callback here, we're going to have the request and response, of course. And in order to send back a response with that HTML file in it, what we're going to do is say response.sendFile. So this is the function that we're going to use to send back files specifically to the front end, right? Instead of doing something like response.json when we wanted to send back JSON data. So response.sendFile, And then we just need to provide the path to the file we want to send back, which is of course going to be, actually we'll import the path library here. So we'll say import path from path. And then down here, we're going to say path.join. And inside here, we'll say underscore underscore directory name. And this is just going to be index.html. Okay, so now that we've done that, we should be able to load this index.html file by sending a request to our server from our browser. So what we're going to do is start up our server by just saying node server.js. And oops, that should actually be source/server.js. There we go. And oops, it looks like we got another error because of the import statements. And actually, in order to avoid having to do all the funny stuff with this directory name thing here when we convert our project to module, I'm just going to switch these things up here to require statements. So we'll say const express equals require express. And same thing with path. We'll just say const path equals require path. Okay, so let's try this again. We're just going to run our code one more time, and sure enough, we see server is listening on port 8080. And if we go over to our browser now and go to localhost 8080, sure enough, we'll see that our code is executed and we get this little pop-up window, which is an alert that says hello from the front end. Okay, and if we click OK, we'll see that everything else will be rendered in the browser. So again, what's happened here is our browser, I'm just going to draw this out one last time here to make sure we have the visuals to go along with it. What's happening is we have our server running over here and our browser over here sends a request to the server. The server sends back that index.html file to the browser, and then our browser basically goes through that file, parses all of the HTML, and when it reaches that script, it executes the script, and that's where we see the little alert displayed. Okay, so we were successfully able to run a little bit of JavaScript code in the browser now, which is our first piece of front-end execution. All right, so if you want to play around with this a little bit, what you can do is just change some of the code that's in this alert if you want to, right? You can write the same kind of JavaScript for the most part that you can write on the back end. There are obviously some things you can't do, like you can't access the file system like you can on the back end because, well, obviously the browser isn't going to let you access your users' file systems on the computer they're visiting your site on. But if you wanted to do something, for example, like log something out to the console, right? Console.log works on the front end just like on the back end, but what it's actually going to do is print that out to a slightly different place. So just to show you what this looks like, we're going to say console.log, and again, we'll say hello from the front end. And if we head back to our browser now and hit refresh, what this is going to do is send another request to the server and load that updated index.html file with the changes we just created. And actually, as a matter of fact, we need to restart our server. So what we're going to do, actually, in order to avoid having to restart our server every time we make a change, we're just going to say npm install save dev node daemon. Okay, so we're installing the node daemon package, and we're going to use that to run our server continuously. So once that installs here, just give that a moment. And then we can run our application by saying node daemon and source/server.js. Oops, and that should be npx node daemon source/server.js, okay? So now that we have our server running, we should be able to go back to our browser and hit refresh. And what we see here now is the new index.html file that we received. That's not really obvious because there was no change here, but we know that because the alert wasn't displayed again. So if you want to see what we logged out to the console on the front end, what you can do is right-click and then click on Inspect. And if you go to the console, sure enough, you'll see the message there that says hello from the front end. So this is the front end console, right? This is where things will be logged out when you say console.log on the front end, and on the back end, obviously, if you log something out, you're going to see that in the terminal. All right, so anyway, what we've seen here is the basics of executing code on the front end when we wrote the code as part of an Express application. So far, it might not be apparent to you what sorts of things we might actually want to do on the front end, right? In other words, what are some things that we could do on the front end that would actually be helpful to our app as a whole, instead of just doing things like displaying an alert or logging to the console? Well, that's what we're going to take a look at here. And one of the first things we're going to take a look at is, in my opinion, one of the most effective things that front-end code can do. What we're going to take a look at is how to have our front-end code load data from our back-end code. So in other words, the logic that we put inside these script tags here many times is going to want to have access to some sort of application data, right? If we were creating some sort of e-commerce site that displayed all of the products, all of their prices, etc., right? I'm just going to draw those like this. Then obviously we're going to want our front end to be able to load all of that product data so that it can display it in the interface here, right? And we're also going to want the front end to be able to do things like add items to cart when the user clicks the button for an item, and other things like that. So in other words, there are lots of situations where the front end is going to need access to the same sort of data that the back end usually gets to work with. And in order to do this, we're going to have to actually write some code inside our front end scripts that will itself make a request to the backend. So this might sound a little bit confusing. Let me just draw this out again. I'm going to be drawing this same server and computer probably about 100 times during this course. All right, but just to try and make things extra clear for you, when the client first requests the file from the backend, right, the backend is going to send back that index.html file, and the browser is going to render that file inside itself so that we can see things like the interface, and it's also going to run any scripts that it finds in the HTML. All right, now what we're going to do here is actually have the script itself, which is, hopefully you can see it, represented by this inner box here. We're going to have the script itself make a request to the server, and the server is going to send back some sort of JSON data that our front end will then be able to use. All right, so in other words, there's two things going on here. The first thing is the browser loading the initial file from our server, right? When we type localhost 8080 into our browser and hit enter. All right, and then the second thing is when our browser actually runs the front end code that we wrote inside this script tag, and that code makes a specific request to the server and gets a response back. So hopefully that's making sense so far. In order to make this work, what we're going to do is open up our server.js file, and we're going to create a separate endpoint that our front-end code will be able to load data from. So this endpoint up here was meant to allow the front end to load a file. The one down here is going to send back some data. So what we're going to do is we're going to say app.get, and for the path here, we're actually going to say /API/ and then depending on what type of data we want to send back, let's say that we just want to send back some simple user data, okay? We're going to say get /API/users, and what this is going to do is it's simply going to return an array of JavaScript objects, each of which represents some sort of user data. So what that's going to look like is we're going to say const users equals, and then our first user will just have an ID of 123, and the name will do Shaun. And then the next user will say ID 234, name will do Bob, and then ID 345, name Sue. Okay, so this is obviously very simplified user data, but the same process would apply regardless of how complex our data is. So now that we have those users, we're just going to send them back to the client side by saying response.json users. Okay, so now that we have these two endpoints, what we're going to do is head over to the front end, and instead of just logging something out to the console directly, we're going to have our front-end code make a request to the back-end. Now, you might wonder how this is done programmatically, right? We were able to make a manual request just by entering in a URL to the browser and hitting enter, but when we want our code to do it, there's a specific function that we're going to use most of the time on the front end, and that function is called fetch, right? And in fact, If you want to learn more about this, just look up the Fetch API. This is a default API that we can use in front-end code that we can use to do things like send network requests, okay? So using the Fetch API is a pretty straightforward process. Really, all that we have to do in most cases is say fetch, right? And this is automatically included, right? It's automatically available in our JavaScript code here. We don't need to import it or anything. And the fetch function can take a number of arguments, but the simplest way to do it is just to pass the URL that we want to send this request to as the first argument. So what this is going to look like is we're going to say /API/users. Okay, and notice that we didn't need to include the full localhost 8080 thing because this index.html file is coming from localhost 8080. So that's just where the browser is automatically going to send these requests that we make with no domain name. Okay? So saying fetch /API/users is going to send a request to the backend, and the default request type, of course, is a GET request. So if we just want to send a GET request to do something like load data, which is the case here, all we need to do is say fetch with the URL. We don't need to specify any kind of options or pass any other arguments. We'll see how to do that later on. So the next thing that we're going to need to do is deal with the results of this fetch call. Now, obviously, network requests such as this one are asynchronous, right? They take a long time. So in order to avoid blocking the main thread, the Fetch API is going to use promises. Now, what this means is we can get the result of calling fetch by just adding .then onto the end of it, and we can pass a callback function to this that is going to take the response as an argument, and inside this callback function now we can do whatever we want with that response. All right, now one thing to know about this response that we get back from the Fetch API is that in order to get the data it contains, we actually need to call another function and return that from this .then callback, right? So we're going to say response.json, and this will give us a JavaScript object or array, whatever the server sent back to us, that we can work with. So all that we need to do now is add another .then onto the end of this, and that will be the actual data, right? That's going to be our users that the server sent back. So now what we can do is just say console.log, and we're going to print those users out to the console here. You could also display them in an alert if you wanted to, but using console.log is usually the way that's recommended to, debug and take a look at the results of JavaScript code. So that's really all that we need to do. Again, what this is going to do is when the browser runs this, it's going to send a request to the endpoint that we defined on our server, and this is going to send back the array of user data, which will then be passed to this callback function. We're going to convert that into an actual JavaScript object, and we can use that final result inside this callback here. For now, all we're doing is logging that out. So let's run this thing and see if it works. What we're going to do is, first of all, you'll want to make sure that your server has restarted successfully. It looks like mine has. And now if we go back to the browser and hit refresh, sure enough, what we'll see is that inside the console here, after our code is completed, it's logged out the user data to the console, and we see that we have all of our user data right here. So in other words, our front end now has access to all of this data that the back end sent over to it. So if we wanted to do some sort of processing with these users, right? If we wanted to filter the users, if we wanted to display them in the user interface somehow, we could do that now that we have access to that data. So anyway, that's how to load data from the backend in front-end JavaScript code. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.